Сьогоднішнього нашого гостя нічого кращого мені не прийшло в голову сказати, як прошу вітати у Львові англійського нейрохірурга Генрі Марша.
Lovely then. I am very happy to be here again. It is an honor and a privilege. You might ask, why is the surgeon talking about freedom of the press and hubris? And the answer is because surgeons are rather like politicians, and they have power. And because we have power over other people, we are at risk of hubris, of becoming overconfident. And that is why there is a connection between politics and medicine. I am very proud of the fact I have been coming to Ukraine for 25 years. And at first, when I went back to England, and I told my friends and colleagues, Ukraine is a very important country. It is a great watershed. It is the place where East meets West, where freedom meets slavery. And my friends would say, Ukraine? Where's that? Isn't it part of Russia? And I'd say, no, it's not. But then, of course, Maidan happened, and I think many people in England and my friends realized I had been right. In fact, Ukraine is a very important country. And I wrote an article for one of the major English newspapers about Maidan and my time there. And I was very proud of the fact there were hundreds of critical comments on the internet afterwards, which clearly came from the Kremlin trolls employed by Putin, because they do not like Englishmen who like Ukrainians and are critical of Russians. So I was very proud to be at Maidan, a small part, and to feel I had played a very, very little bit in the history of Ukraine. And I was especially pleased to see the European flag flying next to the Ukrainian flag, which meant, of course, when Britain voted, or some people voted for Brexit, this was a terrible, terrible shock for me and for all my friends and colleagues and family. I'm half German. My mother was German. I've always felt a European, even though my only language, good language, is English. So for many of us, Brexit has been a truly terrible, terrible event. It is, of course, you might know the American joke, it is turkeys voting for Christmas. And I think many of the people in England who voted for Brexit did not really understand what they were voting for. And in fact, they were lied to by many politicians, and also, in fact, by some of the newspapers. So England now, in a way, is a divided country, just as Ukraine is somewhat divided. London, the university towns of Oxford and Cambridge, and some of the other big cities all voted to stay within the European Union. The people out in the countryside, away from the cities, people without good education, all had this very stupid idea that England would be more successful outside the European Union. I am more worried about Brexit for what Brexit has done to Europe and to Ukraine than I'm worried about what Brexit has done to England or Britain. Although I think many people think there will be a big economic price to pay, probably in 2 or 3 years' time. But Europe has been weakened and damaged by these stupid turkeys, and that is something I'm very sad about. I never thought I would live long enough to say I am ashamed to be English, but that is how I felt after Brexit. So what am I left with? What can I be proud of about England or Britain? Well, What about empirical philosophy? But they were all Scots. David Hume, that's the statue of David Hume. Adam Smith, they were not English, they were Scottish. Landscape gardening, I think some of the best landscape gardening in the world comes from England. And very important is gin and tonic. That's another vital contribution of England to civilization. But there is one thing I'm left with, which I'm proud to say I am British, which is the BBC. But of course, if Scotland votes for independence, it may have to become the Little England Broadcasting Company rather than the BBC. But the BBC, I'm sure you would all agree, has been a very important factor in the role of civilization in the last sort of 80 years. So what do these men have in common? Well, they all hate journalists. Putin actually kills them. Erdogan puts them in prison, but many journalists in Turkey have been killed as well. And the question is, why do they hate journalists? And to answer, to try to begin to understand that question, we need to go back to the origins of the way our brains evolved. This is what is called evolutionary anthropology. Our brains evolved when human beings lived in small groups of what are called hunter-gatherers. And these are the brains, we have the same brains as the last few hunter-gatherer people left, like in New Guinea or the Amazon or the bush people of the Kalahari. But we have the same brains as people, human beings, did 100,000 years ago in the Stone Age. And what was typical of hunter-gatherer society is it is completely egalitarian. There are no leaders in hunter-gatherer society. In a tribe of about 150 people, everybody knows each other, there is complete transparency, there are no secrets. Now, there has been a lot of discussion in the academic literature about to explain the size of the human brain. But if you look at the size of the human brain compared to other primates, which is monkeys, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, there is a fairly good linear arithmetical relationship between the size of the social group and the size of what is called the neocortex, which are the newer parts of the brain that have developed over the last 5 million years. And so gorillas live in groups of about 30, baboons live in groups of, I think, about 20, chimpanzees, the bonobo chimpanzees, live in groups of about 50, and if you then draw the graph to the human brain size, it gives us a social group of about 150. And the evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar has popularized this concept, and he said, how can we look in modern urban society where human beings live in hundreds of thousands? Can we still find this number of 150 is relevant? And I want you to concentrate on this phrase, a cognitive limit, because what I'm talking to you today is about this idea of a cognitive limit. Now, Dunbar says we have a cognitive limit we can understand and relate to about 150 other people. Not just we know them, but we understand all the relationships between those 150 people. Maybe there are about 150 people in this room. Our brain evolved that we could understand all the relationships between all of us in this room, not just the relationship between me and 150 people, but all the relationships between those 150 people. Now that is the model evolutionary anthropologists have of why our brain evolved in the way it has and why it is the size it is. So Dunbar says it is a cognitive limit of a number of individuals with whom any one person can maintain stable relationships. Now with the Neolithic Revolution, when people moved from being hunter-gatherers to agriculture, they lived in larger groups. And our brain cannot relate on an egalitarian basis, so Dunbar says, to more than about 150 people. But Dunbar said, well, how can we look at modern society to see if this number of 150 is true? So he looked at Christmas and mobile phone contacts. If you count up the number of names on your mobile phone, it is unlikely there are more than 150 names there. It's the same for Christmas cards. If you still get Christmas cards in this digital age, the size of the military company, all armies are based around about 150 people. And the average number of Facebook friends, not Facebook acquaintances, but Facebook friends. All this is evidence that we have a cognitive limit. Our brains are limited in how many people we can relate to. So beyond 150, we end up with leaders. And you end up with an unequal distribution of knowledge. Our brains evolved in hunter-gatherer societies where everybody knew everything, they all had the same knowledge. But once you start living in larger groups, you end up with unequal knowledge. And as I'll say later, knowledge is power. And you cannot understand professional people like doctors and priests and politicians without understanding the importance of information and knowledge. Knowledge is power. And people in power will often try to restrict knowledge to keep themselves in power, for reasons I will discuss. So, beyond 150, living in larger social groups, we lose transparency. We cannot see clearly all the relationships between the people we live with. Now, the idea of a cognitive limit is to do with the brain. 25% every minute, 25% of the blood from the heart goes to the brain. Thinking requires energy. It feels free. I think I'm here, I can think anything I like, but in fact we are limited in what we can understand and what we can think. This is the idea of a cognitive limit. So many years ago, the Nobel Prize winning American, well, he did many, he was a psychologist, a philosopher, all sorts of things. Herbert Simon talked about bounded rationality. That is, that our thinking is more limited, more restricted than we think. And as you see, he coined this phrase in 1955, human beings do not possess infinite decision-making capabilities. And it was on the basis of this work that Kahneman and Tversky, whom I'll come back to, have developed this. But the analogy, which I think I might have shown in my lecture at the Medical Academy last year, is the Muller line. Optical illusion, those two lines are the same length, but our brains are hardwired to see them as being different lengths. You could spend the rest of your life looking at those two lines, and they will always look a different length. And this is a sort of cognitive is the English word for thinking. So that is perception, but we are built in to misunderstand that diagram, just as when we are thinking, as I will tell you, we are built in to misunderstand things when we think. So Kahneman is the great psychologist who has published a lot of work upon this, about the way our brains are hardwired to make mistakes. We think we are clever, we think we are right, but a lot of the time we are wrong. And this again is very important when we come back to trying to understand politicians and hubris and nemesis. So cognitive biases is the phrase Kahneman and his colleague Tversky used. Cognitive, we are biased, we consistently make mistakes, and particularly we make mistakes when we have to make decisions when faced by uncertainty. And as a surgeon, I'm always faced by uncertainty. I will say, well, the risks, the probability of what will happen if I do not operate, and then there is a probability of what will happen if I do operate. These are probabilities in the face of uncertainty, and all surgeons will make mistakes. They'll be biased in estimating these probabilities. So Kahneman and Tversky talk about what are called heuristics in English, which are shortcuts. Our brains have evolved in the African savannah 200,000 years ago to save energy, to make quick decisions, to jump to conclusions. You could call them hardwired, they're sort of shortcuts. And Kahneman and Tversky have popularized, they call it System 1 and System 2. System 1 thinking is we think with our gut. We think very quick. We don't think. We immediately jump to a conclusion. And System 2 thinking is when we have to think harder to understand something. And all of us want to go into System 1 thinking. It is easier, it is less trouble, it uses less energy. So the classic example of System 1 as opposed to System 2 is this little joke. And the question is, the bat and the ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. What does the ball cost? System 1, we all immediately jump to say, oh, 10 cents. But of course it's wrong. We actually have to do a bit of mental arithmetic. We have to burn a little bit of glucose in the calculating part of our brain here to work out it is not 10 cents and $1. So that is an example of System 1 thinking, where we have these shortcuts, which perhaps when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger in the African jungle is useful, but in modern society, where we face many complicated problems, these quick decisions, these heuristics that save energy and save time, means we are often wrong. So there are many of these cognitive biases. I will not go into them in detail. I'll just illustrate one, which again I've spoken about before to medical audiences, and this is called the framing effect. The way when we make decisions, we will be influenced by the way the information is presented to us. This, of course, is the basis of all commercial advertising. So this was a question which Kahneman and Tversky showed to doctors and infectious disease specialists, intelligent, educated people. And the question is, an outbreak of an unusual Asian disease is expected to kill 600 people. And then you're given a choice. You said there are two ways of combating this unusual Asian disease. You have a certainty, where you know exactly, definitely what will happen, and then you have a probability, a gamble, and you have to make a decision in the face of uncertainty. So the first choice is option A. If you follow program A, 200 people will definitely be saved. But option B, there's a 1/3 chance everybody will be saved, but there's a 2/3 chance, a risk that everybody will die. So you have to make a choice between a certainty and an uncertainty. And almost everybody, when they're asked this question, they go for option A. They say, well, if maybe 2/3 of people will die with option B, we'd better go for the certainty and be certain that 200 people will live. And then you ask them, well, what about this? Option A, 400 people will definitely die. And option B, there's a 1/3 chance nobody will die, although there is a 2/3 chance 600 people will die. And then almost all of us say, well, we better go for option B, because we don't like the idea of 400 people definitely dying. But of course, it's exactly the same. What has influenced our perception of the uncertainty is simply the way the question has been framed and put into words. And in medicine, patients face this problem all the time. As doctors, we are always framing what we say to influence patients to decide what we think is the right decision. It may be the right decision to make more money or things like that. There are many things that influence us. But these are not simple, straightforward questions. So the conclusion to Kahneman's book, if it can be summarized in one line, is that other people are better at seeing my mistakes than I am. And this is a profound human truth. Other people will not have the same cognitive biases as I have. They will not have the same emotional bias, and they're more likely to see if I'm making a mistake than I am. But, of course, we don't like criticism. None of us like being criticized. I mean, education is a sort of prolonged criticism where you write, you do your work, and then your teacher will comment and criticize. So education, that is how we learn. We learn by being told this is good, this is not good, things like that. But the problem is for senior surgeons like myself and for politicians, it is people stop saying that. And then we start making mistakes. And the point is, of course, to be criticized, it means you have to use system too. You have to think. You cannot use the quick, easy, this is what I feel with my heart. You have to actually think with your brain. And that is hard work. And that takes more energy, more that blood and oxygen and glucose, but your heart is pumping to your brain every second of the day. And the problem is, of course, we all know we learn most from mistakes. In a slightly paradoxical way, success is bad for us. It makes us complacent, it makes us pleased with ourselves, and then we start making mistakes. And I've seen that many times, both with myself and with medical colleagues, particularly here in Ukraine, where people become too self-confident, they start to suffer from hubris. Now, there was a very witty American writer called Mencken. I love this saying of his. For every complex problem, and you can put in brackets, that needs system 2 thinking, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong if you come up with the system 1 answer, if you don't think properly. And Nemesis, the Greeks had this idea of hubris and Nemesis. Nemesis was a goddess who would destroy arrogant men. The Greeks didn't talk about women, they were terrible sexists. And if you were too proud, Nemesis would destroy you. And there are, of course, many examples. Now, the English politician David Owen, he was actually a neurologist doctor, and became a politician. He was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, we say in English, the Foreign Secretary to Tony Blair. And David Owen, after retiring from politics with a psychologist colleague called Davidson, they talked about the hubris syndrome in politicians. And they described this almost as a psychological personality disorder, which is not something you were born with, but is something that politicians are at risk of developing, particularly if they are at first successful. And they describe a list of qualities which, if you think about some of your Ukrainian politicians, I'm sure you'll find familiar. Using power for self-glorification, the cult of the personality, pictures of your leader on the wall, an almost obsessive focus on personal image. Think of Putin flying with cranes, shooting tigers. You know he's a gay icon in America. Excessive self-confidence, accompanied by contempt for advice or criticism from others. It's system 1, you see, it's easier to be vain, to look in the mirror and have many photographs taken of you. It's corruption, loss of contact with reality, which I think you could all say it's happened to Yanukovych. Speaking as a messiah, which Tony Blair started to do. Owen and Davidson started off using this hubris syndrome to describe Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, both of whom were very successful, and both of whom then were just more or less destroyed. Reckless and impulsive actions, and hubristic incompetence. And there are many examples historically of successful leaders who eventually destroyed themselves, and the Nemesis, because they became so pleased with themselves, they surrounded themselves with people who only agreed with what they said, and they started to make serious mistakes as a result. So as I said, knowledge is power. And if you look at the sociology textbooks, what is the definition of a professional? A lawyer, a doctor, a priest, something like that. And of course the definition is the professions are unique and we have special knowledge. We have a specialized role and have control over the occupation's structure, function, practice, and destiny. The fact we have a special knowledge gives us power over the people who come to seek our help. And so, as I said earlier, this applies very strongly to surgeons. Surgeons, we need to take risks, you need to be self-confident. It is that as a politician you need to take risks, but the problem is knowing when the risks are worth taking. As a surgeon, if you did not take risks, you would never help anybody. You have specialized knowledge. And of course, doctors, we bury our mistakes. Our patients die, we can always come up with an excuse for why it happened. So it is very easy for surgeons to deceive themselves, say it is not my fault. In fact, I was working in another country, a lot poorer than Ukraine, a few weeks ago, and I watched a colleague kill 2 patients. And I've had patients who have died after surgery, but at least I hope I then try to think very, very carefully, why did this happen? I discuss it with colleagues, what could we do differently to stop this happening again? But I watched my colleague do 2 operations in a way that I thought was the wrong way to do them. But you know, he was the boss and I hesitated to criticize. But after the operation, he came up, I don't know what the excuses were, but it was a sort of, the operation was a success, but the patient died. So it is very easy, it is very tempting as a surgeon to bury our mistakes, to come up with a false explanation, to come up with a sort of system one, don't think about it, and nobody is allowed to criticize the professor. We work in a hierarchy. It is very vertical. The professor's in charge at top, and the junior doctors will not dare to criticize him because maybe they will lose their job if they do. So, and I guess the irony with medicine is it is nemesis more often for the patient than for the surgeon. Although, to be honest, I was working in Pakistan, in Karachi recently, and my colleagues there said, you know, Henry, it is very difficult to operate when the family are outside the operating room door with Kalashnikovs saying they will kill you if the operation is not a success. So in some countries it can be quite difficult. And I mean, certainly in Pakistan, 500 doctors have been killed in the last 3 or 4 years. So I'm often asked about medical progress in Ukraine. Every time I come here, people ask me, is it getting better? What can we do? And of course, this is a very complicated question. Healthcare is a problem all over the world. It's a problem in America, it's a problem in Britain, because it is becoming more and more expensive. The longer people live, the more successful the healthcare, the more it costs. I mean, the new treatments for cancer, based on stem cell therapy and gene therapy, are becoming more and more expensive. So there is a sort of paradox with healthcare, but the more money you spend on healthcare, the more it costs. The problem does not go away. So there are serious problems in Ukraine, but there are big problems in other countries as well. So of course, it is partly a question of new technology. When I first came to Ukraine 25 years ago, the technology we had in Western Europe and America was not here at all. There were no CT scanners, no brain scanners, no operating microscopes. And of course, over the last 25 years, that has all changed. That is quite easy. I mean, it's a question of economics, it's a question of the economy, but new equipment, novel technology, or whatever you want to call it, is the easiest problem to solve, as is perhaps medical education as well, particularly with a new generation of younger doctors. Better organization, obviously, as is so many aspects of Ukrainian society. Healthcare is chaotic. There are too many hospitals, maybe too many doctors, a lot of disorganization, and that is a political problem. It is a difficult one to solve, but obviously important. And again, obviously, corruption is always very important, very difficult to get rid of. But you're making progress. There is no question of that. There is progress there. But the most difficult thing of all, in many ways, is better decision making, which is all about estimating probabilities and criticism and system 2 thinking, not system 1 thinking. And for better decision making, you need to be more honest with patients. Now true, in countries like Pakistan and Nepal, where I was working a few weeks ago, the patients are not educated. They find it very difficult to understand that an operation might not work. In the hospital in Kathmandu, where I was 3 weeks ago, one patient died, and the family smashed all the hospital windows because they were so angry. So honesty with patients does depend to some extent on the educational level of the patients. But in Ukraine, again, obviously, there is better and better information. Patients and their families are becoming better educated, and the internet has obviously made a very big difference as well. And the really critical thing for me, and the lesson I've learnt, both from working in England and many other countries, and especially working in Ukraine, is the importance of what we call team working. And that is the importance of criticism, of discussion, of understanding that I make mistakes. And the best way I have of not making mistakes is to have colleagues who will tell me, who will discuss with me, and we move away from the idea of the doctor is like Beethoven or Michelangelo and this great solitary genius. Medicine is no longer like that. Perhaps it was 50 years ago, an age of heroic individuals, but in my opinion, the age of heroism in medicine has gone a long time ago. And the really important, we still need leadership. I mean, I'm not saying it should be anarchy, but it is really very important that the good team working, cooperating between colleagues. And I'm very impressed with what I see, particularly now in Lviv, in the younger generation, there is real progress. You are getting away from the old Soviet monolithic, the professor knows best philosophy, which in my opinion is so bad for patients. So I wrote this book, as you know. I'm very proud of the fact there is a Ukrainian edition. But I was talking to a Ukrainian colleague yesterday who said, yes, but it really frightens patients to be so honest, to talk about the fact you make mistakes and operations are not always successful. And my answer to that is, well, patients are frightened anyway, you know? Who could imagine having an operation on your brain without being frightened? And how can you trust somebody? How can you trust anybody if they are not honest? So paradoxically, I think, and I've been told this in England, although my patients in England say, oh, it's slightly frightening, but we trust you more because we know you're honest. And rather than, I don't pretend to be a god, I don't pretend to know everything. But I think honesty is very important. And I've written a new book which will be published in England next week, and I hope there'll be a Ukrainian edition at the Lviv Book Forum in September. And some of the book is about my work in Ukraine, and some of the rather sad lessons I've learned about myself and the mistakes I've made working in Ukraine. Before I became a doctor, I studied politics and economics and philosophy at Oxford University, and I specialized in Soviet politics, and I've read Lenin and all these people. And I think of how Lenin called the European socialists useful fools. And it'd be quite painful for me to realize that in some ways, some of my time here in Ukraine, I was being a useful fool. But one is never too old to learn one has made mistakes. And I don't regret it. I think I like to think I've helped Ukraine and Ukrainian medicine a little bit, but perhaps less than I thought in the past. So, briefly, on the same subject, the same line about democratic elections. Is this the will of the people? I mean, Hitler in 1932, it wasn't an absolute majority, but Hitler was more or less elected to power. Just like Brexit, which is totally stupid, it is the will of the people. And we need to look at democracy as something else. It is not a way of coming up with the right answer. politicians, our societies face very, very complex, difficult problems. Coming back to H.L. Mencken, for every complex problem there is an answer which is simple, obvious, and wrong. The way to look at democracy is it is a way to stop politicians becoming corrupted by power. If they stay in power too long, they'll suffer increasingly. They're at risk of suffering increasingly from the hubris syndrome. They will control the media, they'll shoot the journalists, they'll surround themselves with people who will not criticize them, so they become increasingly narcissistic. And the really important function of democratic elections is that it's a mechanism of stopping politicians sinking into this hubristic trap. And of course, to have proper democratic elections, you have to have the rule of law, which means independent judges. And to have independent judges, you have to pay the judges so much money that they will not be bribed. There's always a financial element to everything. And finally, and equally important, is a free press, so the voters are well informed and the politicians are being continually criticised. So I've finished with the quote by the English 19th century historian Lord Acton, who said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So, and I'm afraid, although I hesitate to say this in a Catholic university, it's not just politicians and doctors. If you've seen this movie, it was about the way the Boston Globe newspaper was critical of exposing sexual abuse by Catholic priests of children in their care. And this is a worldwide problem, and that is because Catholic priests are like doctors, they're like politicians, they have power, and some of them, not all of them, some of them will be corrupted by that. And the best guard we have against that is a free press. So, on the other hand, we do not live in a perfect world. I think what you call the yellow press, in England we call the gutter press, where they're more interested in false health scares and the sex lives of pop stars than serious political issues. And the gutter press in England is not something I'm at all proud of. It is terrible. But it is the price we have to pay to have a free press. We cannot get rid of it. So I would conclude, because this is a school of journalism, and some of you, I hope, are going to be good journalists, is that good journalism is fundamental to a free society. And you are the journalists of the future, and you have a tremendous responsibility to protect freedom and the future of your country. And so, of course, I would end by saying Slava Ukraini. What happens now?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I have two. Well, the first one, can you please explain why did you choose to come to speak to journalists?
I was asked to.
No, all right. Yeah, I didn't expect that. And the second one is, well, in Ukraine, I think I'm not mistaken, only a third of all of the people actually believe journalists.
Yeah.
Like, that they don't trust us. So how do you think we can cope with that? Because yeah, we need free speech, we need journalists for free speech and free society, but they don't.
Well, the problem is you have the tradition of the Soviet time when the press was completely false, as it has become false again in Putin's Russia. And it is about trust. It takes time to establish trust. All you can do is tell the truth and hope people will come to realize you are telling the truth. But there is no quick, easy answer to that. And of course, in Trump's America, Trump talks about alternate facts and he hates the press. All you can do is speak the truth and hope people will understand that. But it is difficult in Ukraine because the tradition was you could never believe the media in the past. There's no equivalent to the BBC.
Mr. Marsh, I have a question. I understand that it will be difficult for you, but could you tell us about the most important mistake in your medical practice?
No, there are far too many to answer that No, there are many, many mistakes. I think it was failing to ask for help when I was faced by a problem where I knew I didn't really know the answer. And rather than ask a colleague for advice, I went ahead and made the wrong decision. I think that probably was the commonest mistake I made, I think. The problem is, as a surgeon, you must be brave. You don't want to start crying and run away and say, help, help, in the middle of an operation. So there is an emphasis on being brave and decisive. But it's a question of balance. Now that I'm reaching the end of my career, I spend the whole time asking other people for advice and what they think, because I know I'm better at knowing what I don't know. But it's a difficult balance. In terms of individual, no, there are so many things I regret, so many mistakes I've made. It's too long to answer. But I mean, the point is, as a doctor, my patients and their families pay the price for my mistakes, and I have to accept that. You know, it is no point, as the American President Truman said, if you can't stand the heat, don't come into the kitchen. You know. But the point is not to lose your judgment, and my colleagues, other people, are better at criticizing me than I am myself. So again and again and again, I think having good colleagues is, and when I say a good colleague, I mean somebody whom I trust, who will comment or criticize without becoming an enemy. And that means you need cooperation rather than fierce competition. And if in many countries the doctors are paid nothing by the state, and so they're all in economic competition among themselves, and that is very bad for medical decision making. When you see a patient, you think, how much money can I make, rather than what is good for the patient.
And so I have another question from other branch.
Mm-hmm.
For example, what do you think about the Muslim problem and Muslim radicalism in Europe and in Britain?
The indigenous population of Europe, that means the white European population, is shrinking. To maintain a human population at a stable level, you need 2.1 live births per woman. And in all the European countries, it is way below that now. So we need immigrants, is the answer. And it's certainly in the National Health Service, the English hospital system, which I work in, most of the nurses and many of the doctors are immigrants from outside. So we need immigrants. The problem is to try to integrate them into our society. And one of the problems with some branches of Islam, particularly from Pakistan, is they close themselves off, they want their own schools, they're reluctant to join English society. And that is a problem. I mean, the answer ultimately can only be education and spending money on immigrants. But of course, the right-wing populist parties say that's terrible. We shouldn't be spending money on these aliens. But actually, we need them. So that has to be the answer. But it is a huge, unprecedented historical experiment going on in Europe with all these immigrants moving in, and I don't know what will happen. But I don't think, I mean, Islam is like, if you need to understand IS and the Taliban, you need to understand Christianity 500 years ago in Europe, where you had the 30 Years' War in Germany, and the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. The history of Christianity is written in blood and fanaticism and Puritanism. And Islam is the same. I'm not saying all religion is bad, I don't say that for a moment, but there is good religion, there is bad religion. And Islam is no different from Christianity in that sense, in my opinion. But you can try shouting.
Well, yeah, okay. I wanted to ask you about medical reform in Ukraine. Are you familiar with it? I mean, the one which will...
No, I'm not, I'm afraid. I'm not, and I don't know much about it.
And didn't you see our Minister of Health?
No, I didn't. I was supposed to meet her, but it didn't happen, so I didn't meet her.
I just wanted to know about your opinion about it, but if you're not familiar.
I'm reluctant to answer that because it is a complicated question. All I'm sure is there are too many hospitals. You know, it needs to be integrated and better organized. But doctors are very difficult people to organize. We are all single monotheistic religions. We're all gods for our patients. We think we're gods. If you have 8 surgeons in a room, you'll have 9 different opinions, you know.
Hello, Mr. Marsh. I'm delighted you arrived to Ukraine again. I wanted to ask a question about reforms, but since it's already been asked, I'm going to ask a different question. What do you think Ukrainian doctors do better than English doctors? Is there anything?
Well, there are a lot of Ukrainian doctors and a lot of English doctors, and I don't know all of them. I think, well, I've seen some very, very good doctors here in Ukraine. I've seen some very bad ones, so I'm reluctant to generalize. I think my impression is the relationship between the Ukrainian doctors I work with now and their patients in some ways is more relaxed than in England. But in England, the English, we are naturally fairly reserved. We do not say what we think, so we do not express our emotions. I don't think there's a big difference, and the patients are the same. I mean, the patients, people when they're ill, or parents of young children with serious problems, we are all the same.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for interesting lecture, and I want to ask, how do you think can the journalists help to form a positive or good image of doctors? Thank you.
Well, on the whole, certainly in England, most of the time is forming a bad image of doctors and exposing the latest medical scandal. Well, I think the role of journalism is more important to criticize doctors in the medical system and to find out bad doctors. We need doctors. As patients, we need doctors. We have to believe in them. We have to trust doctors. So I think it is more important that the role of journalism is critical than positive, to be honest. Maybe in England, people still trust doctors automatically. We have we're treated on the whole with respect and deference, even before we start talking to the patient. I don't know if that's the same here. I know in Russia it is a bit different. Doctors aren't automatically trusted. But again, that goes back to the Soviet past.
It's me again. Well, you mentioned that you had this political studies in Oxford. And how did it happen that you became a surgeon?
Straight into brain surgery. It's a long story.
Well, we have some time for that.
Well, it's in the first book, part of it. It is more in the second book, actually. I talk more about it in the second book. It was a number, one of the mistakes we all make as human beings is to think it is either or, if A, then B, sort of binary thinking. In fact, most things in life there are multiple causes. And when we look back on our life, we think, I decided to do this because of that. And often our memory is false. We tell ourselves, we are lying to ourselves all the time. Self-deception is a very important human skill. So in looking back on why did I change? Well, I was unhappy in love and I ran away from Oxford University. I was rebelling against my father, who was a very good man. There's quite a lot of my new book is about my father, who was a very famous human rights lawyer. I was a young man, I needed a career. I mean, it was all lots of things coming together. And even when I became a doctor, I did not know, I thought I wanted to be a surgeon, but I did not like general surgery, abdominal surgery. It was smelly and messy and I didn't like it. And then by chance, I saw a brain operation and I knew immediately what I wanted to do. It's a bit like falling in love and getting married. I mean, it is the right person at the right time. It's not a rational decision. This is something we think we are making rational decisions. In fact, we are driven by our emotions and our feelings, and these are often beyond our conscious control. As I get older, I believe less and less in free will. And there are interesting neuroscience experiments that cast doubt. It was a very wonderful experiment done many years ago by an American neuroscientist, where he put electrodes, recording electrodes, over the people's brains, and you can pick up electrical activity. If I move my right hand, you'll find there is extra electrical activity in the right hand area of my brain. It was a very simple experiment where he had people sitting in front of a clock, and they had to just record all you have to do is press a button, and they had to look at the clock and record at what point they decided to press the button. Okay, and then they press the button. So obviously there'll be a slight delay of a few milliseconds between deciding to press the button and actually pressing the button. But the extraordinary point, which nobody can really explain, is that the electrical activity in the hand area starts 0.05 of a millisecond before the decision to press the button. So this is the idea is that we are our brains, and some people say our conscious self is just sort of floating on the surface of all this unconscious activity going on in our brains. And it's the same when looking back on our lives. We make things much simpler than they probably were at the time. It is the same with history and political history. Historians like to say why things happen. They say this happened because of that. But then you should say to the historian, well, if you're so good at explaining why things happened, why is it so impossible to predict what will happen in future? So a lot of history probably is a sort of system one simplification. In fact, life is uncertain and it's impossible to predict the future. Who here would have thought that you would be at war with Russia 5 years ago? Totally unpredictable.
Mr. Marsh, from the point of your experience right now as a professional, what you would say to yourself when you were a young doctor, like?
Oh, I've answered that. Learn a foreign language. I'm terribly ashamed. Although I'm the only member of my family who does not speak good German. I can read French, but the French are so rude, I feel very embarrassed when I try to speak French. They look at me murdering the most beautiful language in the world. I go like that. No, I'm ashamed of the fact, although I'm a passionate European and internationalist, I only really speak English. But the trouble is everybody else speaks English, which makes the English lazy. But maybe one day I'll learn Ukrainian. There is also good evidence that people who speak more than one language have lower rates of Alzheimer's disease, or at least it slows down dementia in old age. That doesn't trouble you, it troubles me a lot, the prospect of dementia. So I regret not. So if I could get in a time machine, I would say learn a second language properly. Because when we are young, we have this fantastic ability, particularly as children, to learn languages. And we lose it as we get older. Our brains get less good at learning things. Otherwise, I have no regrets. I mean, I made many mistakes. I don't want to sound like Frank Sinatra and start singing I Did It My Way, but I feel I've been very lucky. I've been very privileged, and particularly privileged to come to Ukraine and get to know your country, because it's a very, very interesting country, and a very beautiful place too, particularly Lviv. A hand at the back, sir.
microphone's not working.
Or a shout. Yeah.
I'll ask a follow-up question and try to be more specific. What advice would you give young doctors with ambitions of doing volunteer work or charitable work as you have?
Well, I think it's quite difficult if you're a young doctor because the purpose, I don't like the word, I've always felt embarrassed about the word charitable, although I suppose technically you could say my work in Ukraine is charitable. But I've had such an interesting time coming here for 25 years, I think I'm the one who benefited most. The purpose of working with colleagues in other medical systems is to help them to become better doctors. It is not really to save individual lives. Yes, occasionally we will, but the fundamental purpose is to help my colleagues become better doctors. So my sort of view has been, I'm here, use me as you wish. And it's a great privilege to be a doctor because medicine is still a sort of international brotherhood. And you can meet colleagues and make friends all over the world. But in terms of at a younger level, I think probably you need to approach organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières or the Red Cross, the international organizations. I'm not very good at working in committees or organizations, so I've always tended to work sort of on my own with my overseas work. There are good international organizations, and I think that would be my advice probably.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I want to ask about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Can the computers being smarter than actually human brain?
Well, again, one cannot predict the future. So I don't know. I am very skeptical about the idea that computers can emulate, the word is emulate, the brain. You may have heard of these crazy people, mainly in America, called transhumanists, who believe that we can download our brains, our consciousness onto a computer, and we'll live forever and travel the universe. Well, the human brain is not a computer. The brain is very, very, very complex. We do not understand. We understand very little, actually, of how the brain works. Over 80 billion brain cells can be connected up to 60,000 other cells. I mean, it's incredibly complex. And we cannot even begin to explain how consciousness arises, how physical matter gives rise to conscious experience, which it certainly does. There is no doubt about that. And just like I was talking about cognitive biases, a lot of our thinking is emotional. We rely on emotion and feeling. If you talk to mathematicians, they will say for them a good mathematical proof is an aesthetic. They say elegant. It is an elegant, beautiful thing. Now, whether computers can be driven by feelings and whether a computer could come up with new mathematical theories because they can feel they're elegant and beautiful, I don't know. But there is more to thinking than doing what computers can do. In the way, I'm not an artificial intelligence expert, but in the way a computer plays chess or Go, although they have learning neural networks to learn, it still is a very different way, as far as we can tell, from the way the human brain works. So I make no predictions about artificial intelligence.
It's me again. So I have two more questions. The first one, do you think seeing so many deaths actually traumatized you? And how should doctors cope with this trauma? And the other one, did it make you fear death more or less?
When you're a medical student, you're presented with a dead body and you then cut it up over, at least I did, and probably the same in Ukraine. You have this dead body and you cut it up into little bits over the course of a year, and you'll see people dying at work. You become used to it. I don't think it's traumatic, but it does give you a different perspective from non-medical people. You become detached. Again, coming back to hunter-gatherer tribal groups, it is a fundamental point point of human society, we divide people into the in-group, which is probably about 150 people, and the out-group. It's a very important concept in anthropology that we have our close friends and acquaintances, and then you have outsiders, like the immigrants and Muslims coming to Europe. We see it's good and bad. And as a doctor, you learn that. Particularly when you become a young doctor, you have to detach yourself from your patients. And you see this as you get older and more experienced. You have to start operating on doctors. And it's very difficult because you have not got that detachment. You worry more when I have a patient who is a doctor. I'm more anxious than when the patient is not a doctor. And it's silly, it's irrational. But it reflects this process of detachment. And of course some doctors become too detached. And then that's bad. So it is a question of balance between compassion, between kindness and professional detachment. Sometimes I made mistakes in my career, particularly about when to stop treatment and let somebody die. When I made the wrong decision because I was too attached, I liked the patient too much. My judgment was distorted by my feelings. So, on the whole, I don't think, as a doctor, you don't get traumatized by it. Death being dead doesn't bother me at all. Dying does. Dying can be a very unpleasant experience. The idea of dying in hospital is not the pain, but it's the loss of independence, the loss of physical independence. I am a great proponent, believer in what's called assisted suicide, doctor-assisted suicide, which we do not have in England. It is in Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, some of the American states. And I think this is a very important sign of a civilized society, that we can, for some of us, we can decide when to leave this life, rather than have to suffer rather miserably in some ugly, miserable hospital, being looked after by strangers.
Of course, we can't predict anything, but in your opinion, how the medicine will change in the next several decades?
Well, looking backwards in brain surgery, progress in brain surgery is to make it unnecessary. Some of the operations now we do through the blood vessels by X-ray techniques. So for surgery, or brain surgery, real progress is to try to get rid of it. I mean, if we could cure all cancer, it would only add 4 years to total average life expectancy, because cancer is a disease of old age. Although all the advertisements for cancer charities show young people, cancer is an old person's disease, and we all have to die sooner or later. Clearly, in the modern world, the two great problems of old age are cancer and dementia, Alzheimer's. And although there is so much research going on into Alzheimer's and dementia, actually there's been very little progress in trying to work out what will happen. So for me, the really one important aspect of medical progress is knowing when to stop. You could spend the entire national income on healthcare, and the entire population would die. And now, in Western Europe, there is an ever increasing population of people with dementia. The brain is worn out. So if we do not find a cure for Alzheimer's, the problem is when do we stop treating people? If you look in America, if you do a graph showing healthcare costs by age, so it goes from about the age of 0 to 60, it slowly goes up in all modern countries. In other words, as we get older, our healthcare costs become more expensive. But in America, beyond the age of 60, it suddenly goes up exponentially. In the rest of the world, it goes on rising gradually. And there is a big problem, as I think all my American colleagues would agree, that when do you stop treatment? And that is a big philosophical, social, educational issue. It's a problem for the doctors, it's a problem for patients, it's a problem for medical institutions. But it's a sort of social equivalent to global warming. Global warming is happening. There's no doubt about it. It's not if, it's when and what the impact of that will be. Some people say it'll be water supplies will be the first crisis, and then sea level rise will be the second crisis by the end of this century. Some of you may just still be alive then. But the problem with healthcare is the same. We are living longer and longer and longer, and we can spend so much money on it, and is it worth it? So one important aspect of progress in medicine is that we can get better at predicting when it is worth treating and when we should stop. There is no point in trying to keep people alive forever, whatever the transhumanists say. And that is because we all have this fear of death built into us. It is part of our evolutionary inheritance. We cannot escape it. We have no choice in that matter. And it is an irrational fear, because death is nothing. I do not believe in an afterlife. So how can we be frightened of nothing? But we are, and that is built hardwired into our brains. And we cannot overcome that. But it is having very difficult economic consequences.
Surgeons are said to be the most cold-hearted doctors. What's your opinion about it?
Well, I think we pretend to be cold-hearted because we have to suppress. When I operate, I saw some children this morning at the Children's Hospital, some with terrible problems, and on my mobile phone, I have a picture. Where's it gone? I have a picture of my granddaughter, whom I love with all my heart. Now, if I started to feel for the patients I see as I feel of my granddaughter, I could not do the work. My hand would be shaking so much. So you have to be cold, you have to be detached. The trick, the art, the difficulty is to find the balance. And that is the idea of being professional, that I might not feel for the patient what I would feel if that person was close to me. But I think, how would I want to be treated if I was the patient? And in fact, there is some work using functional MRI brain scans, where you put people in an MRI brain scanner which shows which bits of the brain are doing what, although it's very crude. I mean, functional MRI scanning is not telling us that much. But there is some evidence that we use a different, when we are feeling what somebody feels. If the patient was my granddaughter, if I was told my granddaughter had a brain tumor, as my son had a brain tumor when he was a baby, the part of my brain would be different from when I see a patient, and I try to understand what they're feeling and how I should behave. So maybe different bits of the brain. So it's a very important part of being a doctor, is although it helps to have personal experience, but you need to be professional and detached. You must be kind, even if you do not actually feel it with your heart. Maybe like an actor. If you're an actor on the stage, if in a way you do not feel the lines you're speaking, you'll be a bad actor. But as soon as you walk off the stage, it means nothing. So to be a good doctor, you must act. You must pretend.
Mr. Marsh, how many years? Sorry, Mr. Marsh, how many years need a doctor to become a good specialist?
Well, it depends. Well, it depends on how many hours a week you work, and it depends on the specialty. There is a lot of discussion in England and America about the way that the hours the young doctors' work have been made much, much shorter. In Europe, with the so-called European Working Time Directive, my junior doctors, my trainees, only work 50 hours a week. When I was a junior doctor 35, 40 years ago, I worked at least 120 hours a week. Some of it was sleeping, it wasn't all work. Again, it's a question of balance. And in America, it's about 80 hours a week, which I think probably is a reasonable compromise. But to operating as a practical skill, like playing the piano, and the more you do, the better you get. So that if you reduce the amount of practice and operating the young doctors do, it'll take them longer to become good doctors. But unlike playing the piano, once you have mastered the techniques, I think most surgeons would say the operating is the easy bit. The difficult bit is the decision making and knowing when to operate, when not to operate. We say in England it takes 3 months to learn how to do an operation, 3 years to learn when to do it, and 30 years to learn when not to do it.
You said that Ukraine is very interesting for you, but why for you is it like that?
Because it is a young country trying to escape a terrible past, and I'm so impressed by all the young Ukrainians I meet, especially in Lviv. Same in Poland, actually. I'd say the same in Poland, but it's a sense of energy, enthusiasm. I know life is difficult here, but I find that very impressive. Western Europe often, to me, feels rather tired, and Brexit and terrible stuff like that.
And what now? What do people in your country think now about Brexit?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't asked all 70 million of them.
But maybe some people who was
Well,
voting for Brexit.
with Brexit, when people voted for Brexit, they did not know what they were voting for, because the politicians who were in favour of Brexit basically lied. They said, we will save £350 million a week and spend that money on the National Health Service. And that was a lie, a complete 100% lie. Nobody knows what will happen. The government doesn't know what will happen. It's complete chaos. And Britain has been part of the European Union for 40 years. All the laws will need to be rewritten. All the trade agreements will need to be rewritten. It is complete chaos. So whether there's going to be a general election in June, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't know what will happen. It is possible that many people will vote against Brexit again, if you can do that. But it is a terrible mess, a terrible muddle, and nobody knows. It is a leap into the dark, is what it is. But the really critical question is now what happens in France. I mean, if Le Pen wins, that could be the end of the European Union, which obviously would have a huge impact on Ukraine. Obviously, Putin must be delighted with Brexit. Russians have been giving money to Le Pen's National Front Party, because obviously what Putin wants is a weak Europe, and a weak Europe will mean maybe the sanctions against Russia over Ukraine will be taken away, and perhaps until Trump dropped cruise missiles on Syria, Putin and Russia was hoping that Russia and America would agree over Ukraine.
I would like to ask you about the relations between pharma companies and doctors, because as I know...
It's corrupt.
Yeah, I know. Actually, I work for a IT company who gives those services to pharmacy, and I'm always thinking if it is correct from their side, because they are buying doctors' decisions for speaking in events.
It is a very corrupt relationship all over the world. There is an English medical writer called Ben Goldacre who has written a book called Bad Pharma. No, Bad Karma. Bad Pharma is the title. And he says, of course, if you say to the pharmaceutical companies, why do you charge such high prices for the drugs? And they'll say, well, it's because it's so expensive to develop new drugs, which is true. But then you should say, but why do you spend 3 times as much on advertising and promotion as you do on research and development? And there's also a big argument in the West at the moment about the publication of drug trials. Because at the moment, most drug trials are paid for by the drug companies, and they do not have to publish the results of trials which do not support their drug. And there is a campaign that this should be changed, and that all the drug trials should be published, not just the ones that favour the drug companies. And we need the drug companies. Okay, they're capitalists, they're not altruists, but it is very corrupt. And I know in Ukraine, and certainly in Nepal and other European countries, what are called kickbacks are quite normal. If a surgeon uses, and in Ukraine the family have to pay for it, this is corruption. Let's say with spinal surgery, where surgeons put metal implants into the spine. In poor countries, the family have to pay for it. But in countries like Greece, the government pays for it. But the company who make the implants will give 10 or 20% of the cost to the surgeon. So the surgeon has a built-in bias to do that, to do too much operating and to use that particular company's implants. So it is something which I think needs the rule of law. You have to apply the law to it, and it should be punished. The drug companies make plenty of money anyway. But it also shows that doctors are easily corrupted. And I tell my trainees, because we have what are called drug representatives, the salespeople for the drugs and the spinal implants. They're usually beautiful young women, and that's because most surgeons are men. So I tell my trainees, if the drug salesperson is a man or is a rather ugly woman, probably it's a very good implant or a very good drug. The sexier the salesperson, the worse the thing they're trying to do. It's true, I'm afraid.
At first, thank you very much for your book, because this is one of that book. When I read it, I cried so many times. So thank you very much. And my question is, you said that the best result of work of doctor is when your patients forget about you.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And do you have some passions which you can't forget and still remember till now?
This is the inner cemetery. I quote the French surgeon Marsh says all surgeons have a cemetery within themselves. Yes, there are many patients I remember. I forget the good results. I tend to remember the bad results. And I think many surgeons are like that, in fact. But we must not think too much about the bad results, or we lose our morale, we lose our confidence. The important point is to learn to remember the bad results and learn from them. Say, could I have done things differently? And that is a question of judgment, and that is why all the cognitive biases are a problem. But yes, I accept, I've forgiven myself. I accept my bad results. I don't know, I don't think I'm a better or worse surgeon than most other neurosurgeons of my experience. I'm better at talking about it, I'm better at writing about it, but that is quite different from actually the operating and the decision making. But I think why my book has been very successful, particularly with doctors, particularly in America, and it's been a bestseller in many, many countries all over the world, is that I'm saying things that most doctors understand and recognize, but nobody, until me, has actually said them in public. But I think it is good for trust. I think if patients feel doctors are honest, they'll trust them more. In fact, I was talking 3 weeks ago to the most senior BBC television political journalist who appears every night on the BBC News. Very nice man. And he recently he told me he had an operation on his throat which went wrong. and he lost his voice. He could not talk to begin with. And obviously, if you're a TV journalist, to have no voice is not a good thing. And the surgeon had not told him this might happen. But it so happened the journalist, who's called Nick Robinson, Nick had just read my book. And he said, well, I read your book, Henry, and I realized probably the surgeon had done his best. And I'm not going to waste time being angry with the surgeon. You know, I forgive him, I want to get on. And then over many months, he gradually got his voice back again. And I was really pleased by that story. I thought that's good. If my book has helped patients understand doctors a bit better, maybe to be more critical, but also more understanding, perhaps I will help the relationship between doctors and patients.
Ще маємо час на пару питань.
Mr. Marsh, when your new book will be written?
Well, it's being written. It will be published next week in England. I hope it will be published in Ukraine in translation in September, and it will be published in America in October. It's a bit different. It's more philosophical. It's about my thoughts about death and retirement, and when should a surgeon stop operating. It is some of the book reviews of my first book said my book was an apology to the many patients I had hurt, and maybe this book in some ways is an apology to my father, because I was not, I mean, we ended on, but I was not a good son in many ways. So I tell, my father was a remarkable man, and I tell some of the stories about his life, because he got Alzheimer's disease, and I kept on saying I must go and talk to him and record his memories, and I left it too long. So I was asked earlier if I could go back to my younger self. Well, one is I'd learn a foreign language properly. The other is I would have recorded my father's stories, because he had a very interesting time. Well, it's in the second book. Very interesting man. And of course, he lived in a very interesting time. He was in military intelligence during the war. His wife was German. My uncle was a Luftwaffe Messerschmitt pilot. So quite a complicated family background. So the new book is a bit more philosophical. The problem with writing a big bestseller with your first book is you are then very anxious about how the second book will be received. With your first book, you have everything to gain. With your second book, you have everything to lose. So I'm very worried and anxious about what the critics will say about the book and whether it will sell or not. But I hope people find it interesting, and we'll see.
Добре, останнє питання. Давайте туди назад, дуже далеко.
I have one more medical question. Mr. Marsh, what do you think about the head transplantation?
Oh, it's rubbish. It's rubbish, is the answer. It's an Italian self-publicizing neuroscientist. And what all medical work on human beings, particularly surgery, usually was tried out on animals first. And as far as I know, nobody has yet done a successful head transplant on an animal. The critical question is the spinal cord. Yes, you can put metalwork to join the head to the bones of the neck. Yes, you can mend the carotid arteries to take blood to the brain. But the problem is getting the spinal cord to heal. And as far as he has got an experimental idea. As far as I know, this has not been tried out on animals. So I think it is very, very bad medicine, very, very bad science to stir up all this publicity about something which is not, where there is not good evidence it would work at all. Do we want head, even if it was possible, do we want head transplants? I doubt it personally. But, and then there's the whole question of the immune rejection, and it's crazy. It's absolute nonsense. There's also something called the vagus nerve, that there are two nerves that go directly from the brain to the rest of the body. Again, actually, I discussed this in my book, The Vagus Nerve. And nobody knows what happens if you cut both vagus nerves, which are separate from the spinal cord. So it is crazy. He says he'll do this in China, but I think probably he is mad.
Давайте на такій трохи веселій ноті закінчимо. Подякуємо